Alright guys, let's wrap up our discussion about plants with Chapter 30. Chapter 30 says Plant Diversity Part 2, the evolution of seed plants. So far in Chapter 29 we talked about the non-vascular plants such as mosses, and then we talked about the seedless vascular plants such as ferns and horsetails and the like, ferns probably being the most common. Now we're going to move on to the category of plants that has the largest number of plants within that category, and that's going to be the seeded plants, and that would be everything from roses to daffodils to oak trees. Most of the usual plants you think of when you think about plants would be seeded plants, and that's what we're going to look at next. So this would be flowering plants or seeded flowering plants. Millions of years ago, when plants first came onto the shore, onto the land, they already began transforming the world, but the evolution of changed the course of plant evolution, and that changed the course of evolution for the entire planet, enabling their bearers to become the dominant producers in most terrestrial ecosystems, and they are still that today. For the most part, when we think about producers, we are thinking about land plants that are seed plants. Seed plants originated about 360 million years ago, and we want to probably get started with the description of what is a seed, something that makes these plants unique or different from the other plants we've discussed so far. A seed is basically an embryo and nutrients surrounded by a protective coat. You could think of a plant seed as being the equivalent of a chicken egg or analogous to a detachable uterus of a pregnant mammal. This seed is basically the offspring plus some nutrition for that offspring, surrounded by a tough protective coating that allows that seed to be transported great distance or to live through some perhaps inhospitable conditions for quite some time. Also, we want to keep in mind that the seed or the creation, the evolution of these seed plants also led to the creation of a change in the human way of life. The domestication of seed plants had begun by about 8,000 years ago, and this allowed for permanent settlements, and it allowed for the move from a hunting-gathering type of civilization to a more sedentary or a more single-place permanent settlement type lifestyle. This changed the course of human history, so the nature of these seed plants is very important even to the study of history and sociology and the study of ancient humans as well. Your textbook has a cool picture here of a domesticated squash seed found in a cave from about 8 to 10,000 years ago, and they think that this was not a wild squash seed because it's slightly genetically different from the wild squash that might have been found in the same area. So this would mean it's perhaps domesticated, perhaps it's already been tamed, if you might want to call it that, by man and changed through selective breeding and the like, the same way that we have selectively bred hundreds of different crops today and animals as well in agricultural type conditions. So we're going to start right here with concept 30.1. It says seeds and pollen grains are key adaptations for life on land. As I mentioned earlier, the change from a water-based life to a land-based life was quite difficult for the plants as they evolved over time. They had to evolve a number of adaptations to survive the drier conditions, the less hospitable conditions to some degree. They had to develop internal structure so they could stand upright against gravity, things of that nature. So in addition to seeds, the following are common to all seed plants: reduced gametophytes, heterospory, ovules, and pollen. We'll take a look closely at each one of these, just briefly at least. So remember, the gametophytes are the ones, the portion of their life cycle where we talked about where they were haploid, and in some of the plants, in the more simple plants, the non-vascular plants, the gametophytes were the major portion of their life cycle, but that's the opposite in the seed plants, where the sporophytes tend to be the major portion of their life cycle. We'll also talk about what heterospory is, and of course ovules and pollen. The gametophytes of the seed plants develop within the walls of spores that are retained within the tissues of the parent sporophyte. So the gametophyte in most of the seed plants is not a separate apart creature. It's retained within the sporophyte part of the plant. Unlike the non-vascular plants we discussed earlier, the seed plants are sporophyte dominant. So the main portion and part of the life cycle that we see is the diploid sporophyte. So when you see an oak tree or a rose plant or a daffodil, you're looking at the sporophyte portion of the life cycle, the sporophyte part of the plant. Your text has a great illustration here kind of showing you the different relationships among the different plant groups. So mosses and non-vascular plants, they are gametophyte dominant, and it shows you the gametophyte is the main portion of the plant, with the smaller sporophyte being the portion here at the top. Then in ferns and other seedless vascular plant, the sporophyte becomes the dominant portion, and the gametophyte tends to be very small, even hard to find sometimes. And that's also going to be the case for the seed plants, the gymnosperms and angiosperms we're going to look at, where the sporophyte is the dominant portion, and the gametophyte is usually so reduced that it's usually microscopic, and it's dependent upon the surrounding sporophyte tissue for nutrition. Now notice in the ferns that the gametophyte's also reduced, but it's still an independent, separate photosynthetic and free-living part of the plant. And in the seed plants, that's not the case. The gametophyte doesn't really live separately and apart. It's dependent upon the sporophyte for providing it nutrition and materials that it needs to survive. The other basic characteristic that is pretty much the rule among seed plants is what we call heterospory. Heterospory is the following. The ancestors of seed plants were likely homosporous, meaning they produced a single type of bisexual spore capable of going on to produce both male and female gametes, while seed plants are heterosporous. Heterosporous means they produce separate male and female spores that then go on to create the separate male and female gametes. Megasporangia produce megaspores that give rise to female gametophytes, and the microsporangia produce what we call microspores that then give rise to the male gametophytes. So unlike some of the other simpler plants that we looked at, the mosses and the like, they were homosporous, or the ancestors of the seed plants that we're looking at were homosporous, meaning they produce a single type of spore that could go on to be either the male or female gametophyte. Now in the more modern seed plants, we have a separation of those sexes, where we have a male and a female separation. Although a few species of the seedless plants are also heterosporous, meaning they produce the separate male and female spores, there is something that is kind of unique to the seeded plants, and that would be the production of ovules. An ovule consists of a megasporangium and the megaspore, and then one or more protective coverings, what we call integuments. Gymnosperms, like the pine trees and the evergreens, their megaspores have one integument, and angiosperms, like azaleas or oak trees, their megaspores usually have two integuments. So in this illustration we see an unfertilized ovule. The ovule is going to include the megasporangium, which produces the megaspore. That's going to be, in this case, the female. Remember, that's going to go on to create the female portion. And then it's surrounded by two integuments, in this case, two different kind of protective layers. There is one single opening down at the bottom called a micropyle, and that's for the pollen grain to enter and fertilize the egg inside. On the male side, on seeded plants, we have the production of pollen and sperm. Microspores develop into pollen grains, which you're probably familiar with, which contain the male gametophytes. Pollination is the transfer of pollen to the part of the seed plant containing the ovule. So in the case of like a lot of the non-vascular plants, the sperm were flagellated. They basically had to swim through a film of water. But in most seeded plants, they use a more dry pollen that can be carried by the wind or carried by insects, carried by birds, things of that nature. Pollen eliminates the need for a film of water and can be dispersed great distances by air or animals, so this makes it an advantage over, say, the flagellated sperm of the more simple non-vascular plants. If a pollen grain germinates, it gives rise to what we call a pollen tube that discharges sperm into the female gametophyte within the ovule. Here we have a fertilized ovule where we have a pollen grain that has landed and fertilized, and then that produces a small tube that discharges the sperm nucleus into the egg nucleus and fertilizes the egg inside. The evolutionary advantage of a seed is pretty significant. A seed develops from that whole ovule, from that whole fertilized ovule, and a seed is basically a sporophyte embryo along with its food supply packaged in a protective coating, and that gives it a great advantage because that can be spread far and wide, and it can go great distances. It can withstand maybe improper environmental conditions until those environmental conditions are more favorable, and you have a much greater chance of spreading your offspring a greater distance and having those offspring survive. So here we have the unfertilized ovule, then the fertilized ovule, and then that ovule develops into a seed. And a seed is going to contain the embryo itself, plus basically a food supply around it, and then a seed coat, which is going to be the protective coating on the outside. So seeds provide some great evolutionary advantages over spores. For one thing, these seeds can remain dormant for days up to years until conditions are favorable for germination. Seeds have a supply of stored food already inside of them, unlike the spores, which better land in a good spot for growing. The seed can have this supply of stored food, which allows the growth of the new baby plant until it gets up above the ground, or until it gets its leaves formed and out and can start doing photosynthesis. And of course, the seeds can also be transported long distances by wind or animals. Some seeds, like dandelion seeds, have evolved to be transported by wind. Some, like different kinds of sticker burrs, have little Velcro type hooks on them that hang onto your dog or your pants leg. And then some are designed, or they have evolved to have fruit, flesh, sweet coverings that may be eaten by animals and then pooped out, 20 miles later, 15 miles later at a different spot. So these various seed adaptations are evolution's way of giving the plant a greater chance of spreading its offspring a much greater distance, and that way the parent offspring is not competing for light and resources and water with its own offspring. The parent and the offspring are not in competition with one another. So we're going to stop right there for just a moment. So that is the basics of seed plants and some of the 4 things that they have that make them unique or separate from some of the other plants we've looked at. We'll pick up with concept 30.2, which says gymnosperms bear naked seeds typically on cones. So we're going to look at the difference between the gymnosperms, which is more like the pine trees and evergreens, and compare that to the angiosperms, which would be pretty much all the other seeded plants. So we'll take a break. We'll be right back.